Hello, and welcome to this lecture entitled Historic Preservation and Historic Site Management for the Public Historian. Let's define both of these because they're interrelated. That is, historic sites are often preserved areas, and preserved buildings and preserved areas often become historic sites. The difference to a great extent is in their use and ownership. Are they private or are they public? If they're public, we tend to call them historic sites. If they're private, we tend to call them preservation projects. Now let me tell you an anecdote about how some people feel about preservation. I once worked with a fellow on a campus master plan committee who said that to him, historic preservation began with a bulldozer. Now, it's certainly true that not all old buildings deserve preservation because preservation is expensive and difficult, but not all old buildings deserve wholesale destruction either. Sometimes developers see preservation as part of the so-called liberal agenda to prevent them from having the freedom to exploit their property however they want. But preservation is, like the environmental movement, profoundly conservative, though not necessarily pro-development. That is, both the preservation movement and the environmental movement seek rules and regulations to slow change down and to create homeostasis. The federal government got involved in historic preservation with legislation in 1906, that is, with the American Antiquities Act of 1906. The Antiquities Act authorizes U.S. presidents to declare portions of government property to be national monuments. Now, since 1906, 16 of 19 presidents in the 20th century used the American Antiquities Act to denote national monuments. The three that did not were Presidents Nixon, Reagan, and the first President Bush. The original American Antiquities Act began to stop rampant depredations to Native American archaeological sites. Theodore Roosevelt used the act to proclaim the first national monument, which was Devil's Tower in Wyoming, and this occurred on September 24th, 1906. And in 1979, the Archaeological Resources Act amended the American Antiquities Act of 1906. The second major piece of federal legislation concerning historic preservation is the National Historic Preservation Act of 1966. This was part of President Lyndon Baines Johnson's, LBJ's, Great Society. The Great Society included things like the War on Poverty, the Equal Employment Opportunity Commission, and Head Start. It included consumer safety laws like the thing that created seat belts, product labeling, credit info. Also, the Civil Rights Act of 1964 and the Voting Rights Act of 1965 were part of the Great Society, as was the National Endowment for the Arts, the NEA, the National Endowment for the Humanities, NEH, and things like the Highway Beautification Act. The National Historic Preservation Act defined itself to be in favor of the preservation of irreplaceable heritage in the public interest, so that its, that is, irreplaceable heritage, vital legacy of cultural, educational, aesthetic, inspirational, economic, and energy benefits will be maintained and enriched for future generations of Americans. That is to say, this was the reason that the National Historic Preservation Act existed. One of the things that the National Historic Preservation Act did was to provide a mechanism by which the federal government could assist state historic preservation authorities, and this is in Section 2 of the Act. There is a mandate in the Act, and I'm reading from the Act now, that says that the National Historic Preservation Authorities will assist state and local governments, Indian tribes, and Native Hawaiian organizations, and the National Trust for Historic Preservation in the United States to expand and accelerate their historic preservation programs and activities. Title I, Section 101 establishes also the National Register of Historic Places within the Department of the Interior. The register created for proposing and placing districts, sites, buildings, structures, and objects significant in American history, architecture, archaeology, engineering, and culture. Let's look now at some of the criteria for including something on the National Register of Historic Places. First, the first criteria, that is, for inclusion are that the site or area be associated with events that have made a significant contribution to the broad patterns of national history, or that are associated with the lives of significant people in the past. Another reason for inclusion on the National Register is that the thing you want to include embodies the distinctive characteristics of a type, like architecture, a period or method of construction, or that represent the work of a master, or that possess high artistic values, or that represent a significant and distinguishable entity whose components may lack individual distinction, or finally, that have yielded or may be likely to yield information important in history or prehistory. Now, one of the most important things about this act, the Historic Preservation Act, is Section 106. Section 106 provides for a review of any changes to existing National Register items, either districts or buildings or sites. Whenever federal money is used to construct, demolish, rehabilitate, or otherwise alter those structures or sites that are either on or eligible for the National Register. Now, I bring up the 106 review because just recently we had an issue about 50 miles north of Dothan, in which the town of Eufaula, Alabama wanted to enlarge a highway. And because of the 106 review, the entire expansion project was paid for by significant amounts of federal money, except for an 8/10 of a mile stretch through the middle of an historic district that the highway already ran through. That was paid for exclusively by state and county money in order to avoid the Section 106 review, which is not triggered when someone wants to alter a National Register area, but is triggered only when there is federal money involved. There are three main goals for the Section 106 review. And this is important to know if you go into historic preservation. The 106 review is there to identify historic and prehistoric properties that are eligible for or listed in the National Register. This is pursuant to any major alterations. It also requires an assessment of the effects of that alteration on the properties, and it requires the person or entity doing the alteration to seek ways to either avoid or mitigate or minimize the adverse effects on the historic sites or properties. Now, one of the things that the National Historic Preservation Act did was to authorize federal assistance to state historical commissions. Now let's talk a little about this. Every state has its own Historical Commission. I can speak on the Alabama Historical Commission because I've dealt with it for so many years. The Historical Commission in Alabama is a distinct entity. It's a line item in the budget of the state. It maintains the Alabama Historic Preservation Agency, the mission statement of which is to preserve, protect, and interpret Alabama's historic places. Now, in addition to owning a number of properties and managing those properties as historic places, the Alabama Historical Commission has a set of programs. One of them is the Alabama Register of Landmarks and Heritage. It's similar to the National Register, with some slight alterations. The properties have to be at least 40 years old. They have to be associated with events of state or local significance, associated with the lives of people of state or local significance. They might represent a type, style, or period of architecture, and they might be associated with Alabama's history or prehistory. You see, these are very similar to the National Register criteria, and they're modeled on the National Register criteria. The Troy University has a campus in Troy and a campus in Dothan, Alabama. That's in Pike County for Troy and Houston County for Dothan. There are 12 of these site listings on the Alabama Register of Landmarks and Heritage in Houston County near Dothan, and there are 16 in Pike County. Another of these programs of the Alabama Historical Commission is the Main Street program. That is, Alabama communities have revitalized their downtowns in this program through the National Trust for Historic Preservation's 4-point approach. They have created a downtown organization to assist in historic revitalization. They promote the downtown. They design new and old space to revitalize, and they restructure the economics of the downtown core. That is, the Main Street program is to help smaller communities redevelop their dying downtowns. Another program is the Certification of Local Government Preservation Programs, a Historic Cemetery Registry Program, Historic Markers Program, Historic Landmarks Program, and a Places in Peril program. This is specific to Alabama. The designation as a place in peril is supposed to help focus and fundraise for revitalization of that place that is in peril. Now, this has been currently suspended as of 2014, but when budget woes are over in the state, we hope to see a revitalization of this particular program. There's also a survey program for architectural surveys that identify, document, and evaluate a community's physical, historic resources. The survey is the basic step in creating a realistic preservation program both at the state and local levels. And this is one of the programs of the State Historical Commission, at least in Alabama. Now let's look now at historic properties in public, that is, house museums and historic sites, as opposed to all of this information we've just discussed about preservation. Historic properties, house museums, historic sites are similar to museums, and they're similar to each other because they rely on visitors. They collect, preserve, and use material culture to educate, and because of your visit to a historic site, you know that this is true. You've already been there and you have experienced what those folks have to offer, and you may not have articulated it, but this is probably what you came away feeling that they were doing: collecting, preserving, and using material culture to educate their visitors. These house museums and historic sites share the same problems and the same sources of funding that museums do. And they have the same needs for skills and education for effective leadership that museums have. If you want to go into this kind of work, you should have education in preservation because of the duty to preserve and the similarity of house museums to building preservation efforts. You'll need education in research to understand how to collect and interpret material culture. You'll need education in grant making. You'll need skills in conducting training for the staff and even for volunteers and sometimes even for the public. You will need skills in entrepreneurialism. You'll need skills and education in administration and management, which are two distinctly different things. You'll need skills in politics and in working with legislators and commissioners. So please, if you go into historic preservation, house museums, historic sites, please add courses in business administration, public administration, entrepreneurialism, marketing, finance, and leadership. And with these, you can create what you might call an entire package that will be very attractive to those looking for leaders in house museums, historic sites, and preservation efforts. And with this, we conclude the lecture, and as always, I thank you for your attention.